We hear a lot of talk of how arch height in running may influence injuries, and that some experts caution that if your arches are too high or too low, could make you more prone to injury. However, many studies on how too high or too low arches contribute to running related injuries have mainly been on heel strike runners, given that there is a long line of research showing that abnormal arch height seems to be a consistent risk factor for injury in heel strike runners. Could landing with a forfeit strike when running reverse this particular trend? In other words, when it comes to heel strike versus forfeit strike running, would having too high or too low arches still be a very big risk factor for injury in forfeit strike running, like it seems to be for heel strike running? The answer to that may be no, and I'll explain why research that has proved more direct evidence for too high or too low arches being more of a risk factor for injury in heel strike running. And all the studies I'm referencing are linked down below this video in the description box. A 1990 study in the journal American Orthopedic Foot and Ankle Society found that heel strike runners with high arches had too much back and forth movements of the foot at heel strike, which led to greater landing instability. This resulted in increased rapid internal rotations of the shin shortly after heel strike, which is a well-known risk factor for runner's knee and anterior shin splints. The heel strike runners with higher arches also continued to produce higher levels of force on the heel at heel strike as compared with the heel strike runners with low arches. More current evidence supported this in that a 2014 study in the Journal of Athletic Training found that heel strike runners with high arches generated higher initial loading rates and peak impact, which means they generated a sudden burst in high impact that exceeded tolerance during stance, of which squares up with reports in a 2005 study in the journal Foot and Ankle International and a 2010 study in the journal Foot Edinburgh, Scotland, which found that heel strike runners with high arches were more likely to suffer heel pain and stress fracture because higher arches were found to be inflexible and less able to absorb shock in the foot as compared with heel strike runners with lower arches. But the heel strike runners with lower arches weren't all that better off in having better injury prevention outcomes, in that in the 1990 study that I just spoke about found that heel strike runners with low arches had greater loading on the lower back because they produced higher acceleration rates and amplitude at the lower back. This jives with results from a 2001 study in the journal Clinical Biomechanics, which found that heel strike runners with lower arches may have an increased risk for soft tissue injury because lower arches or flatter feet may not be well adapted to absorb the accumulated loading at heel strike. What's meant by accumulated loading is that in heel strike running, at heel strike, there's just more all-around impact levels occurring in greater magnitude and longer in duration. There's also a burst of a collisional force that persists longer in duration, all of which are the normal accompaniments when you run with this specific landing configuration that involves the foot striking the ground really far back on the heel, while the front of the foot is pulled really far back, coupled with an unbent knee or a hyperextended knee as well. Since too high or too low arches seems to amplify the already high impact nature of heel strike running, would runners with abnormal arch height be less prone to injury in forfeit strike running on account of all-around impact levels are often much less in forfeit strike running? A key piece of evidence from a 2005 study in the journal Foot and Ankle International found that the sequence in load reduction at touchdown in forfeit strike running was unaffected by arch height, and that too high or too low arches didn't magnify or intensify impact forces or exaggerate abnormal motions of the foot during stance or at touchdown that would otherwise place additional stressors on the foot and the leg. Whereas in heel strike running, too high or too low arches just seems to amplify the assortment of high impacts that are often accompanied with heel strike running. This is very hugely significant because it suggests that, as it stands, there's really no direct relationship of arch height profile producing higher forces in forefoot strike running, and therefore it may then follow that arch height profile alone might not be a risk factor for injury for runners with too high or too low arches who run with a forefoot strike landing pattern versus a heel strike landing pattern. One potential reason for this is that because the foot engages, configures, and loads differently at touchdown in forefoot strike running, too high or too low arches doesn't really seem to interfere in a negative way, whereas the way the foot configures with the ground in heel strike running, too high or too low arches seems to clash with the way the foot loads when landing heel first when running. As a result, more force components may arise, which has been indicated in multiple studies during the past decade. So I just thought it would be very worth noting that the concept of arch height profile, which is something that's very commonly used as a clinical descriptor in running and is often pegged as a major risk factor for injury in running, there is some evidence to support that runners with abnormal arch height may be at much less risk for injury if they run with a forefoot strike instead of a heel strike landing pattern. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you did, feel free to the thumbs up button as well as the subscribe button if you haven't already, where you will stay more informed on heel strike running versus forefoot strike running, as well as more informed on the health and performance benefits of barefoot and minimalist running. Thank you so much for listening and watching. Have fun out there on the roads and trails. Bye for now.